My sister-in-law spent years trying to steal every milestone from me. She announced her engagement at my actual engagement party, but her groom walked away after I asked them a question. When I started dating my fiancé Ryan 4 years ago, his sister Heather immediately made it weird. She'd sit between us at family dinners, constantly brought up inside jokes from their childhood, called him at midnight crying about random problems that only he could solve. Ryan thought she was just protective since their dad died when they were young. I tried to be understanding, but then it became a pattern. When I graduated nursing school, Heather suddenly announced she was going back to school too, for the same degree, at the same ceremony dinner. When I got promoted to charge nurse, she got a job at a medical office the next week and told everyone she was basically running the place. When Ryan and I moved in together, she signed a lease for the apartment directly above us. She had a key for emergencies and would use it constantly. I'd come home to her cooking dinner in my kitchen, reorganizing my closet, even once found her trying on my clothes. Ryan always defended her, said she was just lonely and trying to help. The engagement was where everything exploded. Ryan proposed on our anniversary in January, private and perfect, just us at the beach where we had our first date. We told our families the next day. Heather cried for 2 hours. Not happy tears. Actual sobbing about how everything was changing, how she was losing her brother, how she'd be alone forever. Ryan spent the rest of the day comforting her instead of celebrating with me. We planned our engagement party for March. Sent invitations, booked a venue, hired a photographer. Heather offered to help with decorations. I thought maybe she was finally accepting things. The morning of the party, she called Ryan 15 times. Emergency, she said. Her boyfriend of 2 months, Keith, was acting distant. She needed her brother immediately. Ryan left me handling last-minute setup alone while he drove to her apartment. They didn't answer my calls for 3 hours. Guests started arriving at 7. Ryan and Heather showed up at 7:30. She was wearing a white dress. Not cream, not ivory, actual white. And Keith was with them, looking confused but dressed in a full suit. Before I could ask what was happening, Heather grabbed the microphone from the DJ. She had an announcement. Keith had proposed that afternoon. They were engaged too. Wasn't this perfect timing? Now we could celebrate together. The room went silent. My mom looked like she might faint. Ryan's mom started clapping slowly, probably out of shock. Keith just stood there, clearly having no idea what was happening. Heather kept talking, saying how Keith had been planning this for weeks, how he wanted to do it before our party so we could share the special day. Keith's face was pure panic. He pulled out his phone, started scrolling frantically, showing something to his friend near the bar. That's when things got interesting. Keith's friend walked over to me and whispered that Keith had been showing him texts from Heather that morning. She'd told him to wear a suit and come to a family party. Nothing about proposals or engagements. He had no idea she was going to do this. I walked straight to the microphone and took it from Heather. Congratulated her on her creative announcement. Then I asked Keith to show everyone the ring he'd clearly spent so much time picking out. Keith went pale. There was no ring. Heather started stammering about how it was being resized. I asked when exactly he proposed. She said that afternoon, around 2. Interesting, since Ryan was with her from noon to 7:30 and never mentioned Keith being there. Ryan's face finally showed understanding. I turned to Keith and said I was sorry he'd been dragged into this, that he deserved better than being forced into a fake engagement at someone else's party. Keith walked out immediately. Didn't say a word, just left. Heather started screaming at me, saying I ruined everything, that I'd turned everyone against her, that I'd stolen her brother and now humiliated her. She actually said I should share the spotlight since I had everything and she had nothing. Ryan finally spoke up. He told Heather she needed to leave right now. His voice was shaking, but he actually said the words instead of making excuses for her. Heather's face went from shocked to absolutely red with anger. She started screaming even louder than before, saying he was choosing me over his own blood and their dad would be so ashamed of him for abandoning his sister. The guests who were still there just stood frozen in place. Nobody knew what to do or where to look. Some people had their phones out filming the whole thing, even though my mom was quietly going around asking them to please stop recording. I could see the red recording dots on at least 5 phones pointed right at us. Ryan's mom, Julian, rushed over from where she'd been standing near the exit. She tried to put her hands on Heather's shoulders to calm her down. Heather actually shoved her away hard enough that Julian stumbled backward into a table. Heather kept screaming that I'd poisoned everyone against her and turned her own family into enemies. The mascara was running down her face in black streams all over that white dress. She looked completely out of control. My brother Drew had been standing with my dad near the bar. He walked straight up to Heather and told her in this really firm voice that she needed to leave before he called security. Drew isn't a big guy, but he was dead serious. Something about the way he said it finally got through to Heather. She stopped screaming and just kind of stumbled toward the exit with her hands shaking. Julian followed her out, but not before she shot Ryan this look that made him actually flinch, like she was devastated and blaming him for everything. The DJ must have gotten some signal because he started playing music again to fill up the awful silence. But it was too late. Half the guests were already grabbing their coats from the coat check and making up excuses about having to leave early. I heard at least 3 different people say they had babysitters waiting or early mornings tomorrow. My mom came over and hugged me really tight. She whispered right in my ear that I did the right thing and she was proud of me. Ryan just stood there looking like he might actually throw up on the floor. His face was gray, and he kept staring at the exit where his mom and sister had just left. Within 20 minutes, the whole venue had basically cleared out. The only people left were my parents, my brother Drew, and Ryan's best friend who'd been standing near the DJ booth the whole time. Ryan's friend came over to help us deal with the photographer who was packing up his equipment. The caterer was in the kitchen area looking confused about all the untouched food. We'd paid for a 4-hour party that lasted maybe 90 minutes total. All that money just gone. I couldn't even make myself care about it right then. I was too numb. Ryan kept saying he was sorry over and over like a broken record, but I couldn't really process his words. My brain was stuck on the fact that this confrontation just made everything so much worse instead of better. We finally left around 9:30 and got home a little after 10. I was fishing my keys out of my purse when Ryan opened the door and we both just stopped. Heather was sitting on our couch. She'd let herself in with that emergency key we'd given her when we first moved in. She'd calmed down from the screaming, but her eyes were all red and swollen. The mascara was dried on her face in streaks. She looked up at us and immediately started in with this quieter version of her earlier accusations, saying I was jealous of her relationship with Ryan and trying to control him, that I was manipulative and had orchestrated this whole public takedown to humiliate her. Ryan's voice was tired when he told her to give him the key and leave. Heather said no, just flat out refused. She said she had every right to be there since he was her brother and she needed him. I felt something break inside me. I told Ryan I was going to my mom's house because I couldn't do this anymore. Not right now. Heather actually smiled when I said that, like she'd won some kind of game. Ryan grabbed my arm and begged me not to leave. Then he walked over to where Heather's purse was sitting on the coffee table. He just reached in and started digging for the key. Heather jumped up and tried to stop him. They actually got into this ugly physical struggle over her purse. She was hitting his hands and trying to pull the purse away while he held on. I heard footsteps on the stairs and Drew came through the door. He'd followed us home, I guess. He saw what was happening and stepped right in between them. Drew took Heather by the arm and told her she was leaving now. She started sobbing and saying everyone had abandoned her and nobody loved her. Drew didn't argue or try to calm her down. He just walked her to the door and out into the hallway. We could hear her crying all the way down the stairs. Ryan locked the door behind them and put the key on the kitchen counter. Then he just slid down the wall and sat on the floor. We stayed up until 3 in the morning just talking. Actually talking for the first time in 4 years about all of this. I told him everything I'd been trying to say about Heather's behavior. How she copied everything I did. How she invaded our space constantly. How she tried on my clothes and reorganized my closet. How she always had some crisis that only he could solve. Ryan didn't defend her this time. He actually listened. He admitted he'd been so scared of her falling apart that he just enabled everything she did. He said after their dad died, Heather had this complete breakdown, and he'd felt responsible for keeping her stable ever since. His mom had made it clear that keeping Heather calm was his job. He'd been doing it for so long he didn't even see how messed up it was anymore. I told him I was exhausted and hurt that it took public humiliation for him to finally believe me, but I could see he was genuinely horrified by what he'd been dismissing as normal sisterly behavior for years. The next morning, I woke up to my phone going crazy with notifications. Texts from people who'd been at the party asking if I was okay. Messages from friends saying they'd seen something on social media. I opened one of the links somebody sent me. Heather had written this long post about being betrayed and humiliated by her brother's cruel fiancé. In her version, I was this jealous, manipulative person who'd orchestrated a public takedown because I couldn't handle sharing the spotlight. She said Ryan was my brainwashed puppet who I'd turned against his own family. She made herself sound like this innocent victim who just wanted to celebrate love. The post had like 100 comments already. People I didn't even know were saying how sorry they were for her and how toxic I sounded. I felt actually sick reading it. Ryan called his mom around 10 that morning. I could hear Julian's voice through the phone even though I wasn't on speaker. He told her they needed to talk about what happened. Julian started crying. She admitted she'd known for years that Heather had unhealthy attachment issues. After their dad died, Heather became completely obsessed with Ryan. She saw him as her only source of security, and her whole identity got wrapped up in being his sister. Julian thought she'd grow out of it eventually. She didn't want to make things harder by forcing Heather into therapy or setting boundaries. That made me so angry I had to leave the room. Everyone just let this escalate for years because it was easier than dealing with it. I went to work on Monday even though I really didn't want to. My coworker Courtney grabbed me the second I walked onto the floor. She asked about the engagement party drama right away. Apparently several people we both knew had seen Heather's social media posts over the weekend. The story was spreading through our whole social circle. I gave Courtney the real version of what happened. About the fake engagement and Keith walking out and Heather's meltdown. Courtney's face just kept getting more shocked as I talked. When I finished, she said Heather's behavior sounded like a serious mental health crisis that had been ignored way too long. She asked if Ryan's family had ever gotten Heather actual help, and I told her no. They just kept making excuses and expecting Ryan to manage her emotions. Courtney said that wasn't fair to anyone, including Heather herself. Tuesday afternoon, my phone buzzed during my lunch break. Keith's name popped up with a text asking if we could meet for coffee because he needed to understand what really happened at the party. I stared at the message for a minute before texting Courtney asking if she'd come with me as backup. She agreed immediately, and we set up a meeting at a coffee shop halfway between the hospital and Keith's apartment for Wednesday evening. When we got there, Keith was already sitting at a corner table looking like he hadn't slept much. His eyes were red and he had this mix of embarrassed and angry on his face that made me feel bad for him all over again. He stood up when we approached and apologized right away for bothering me, but said he'd been going crazy trying to figure out what Heather had been planning. I sat down across from him while Courtney took the chair next to me, and Keith pulled out his phone without any small talk. He scrolled through his messages with Heather and turned the screen toward me. The text went back almost 2 months, and I could see immediately how she'd been setting him up. The early messages were normal dating stuff, talking about movies and restaurants and getting to know each other. But then around 3 weeks in the tone shifted and Heather started moving way faster. Texts about how connected she felt to him, how she'd never met anyone who understood her like this, how she could see a real future together. Keith said he thought it was just her being enthusiastic and open about her feelings, which seemed sweet at the time. He scrolled further and showed me texts from 2 weeks before the party, where Heather started mentioning this important family event. She never said engagement party or mentioned me and Ryan at all, just kept saying she wanted to introduce him to everyone, and it would mean so much to her if he came. The texts closer to the party got more specific about what to wear and when to arrive, but still nothing about engagements or proposals, or sharing any spotlight. Keith's hands were shaking a little as he scrolled, and I could tell he was genuinely upset about being used like this. He said Heather had been love-bombing him for 2 months straight, talking about moving in together and meeting each other's families and planning trips for next year. He thought she was just really into him and wanted to get serious quickly. Not that she was using him as a prop in some weird game with her brother's fiancé. The texts from the morning of the party made me feel sick. Heather had sent him the address and told him to wear his nicest suit because it was a formal family celebration. She said she'd meet him there and was so excited for him to finally meet everyone who mattered to her. Keith looked at me with this pained expression and said he'd walked into that party with no idea what was about to happen, just thinking he was being a supportive boyfriend at a family thing. When Heather grabbed the microphone and started talking about engagements, he'd been completely confused, and when she said he'd proposed that afternoon, he literally thought he was losing his mind. He apologized over and over for being part of her scheme even though he didn't know about it, and I told him he didn't need to apologize because he was manipulated just like everyone else. Courtney jumped in and said Heather's behavior toward him was actually scary. That level of calculated lying and using someone as a prop showed something really wrong with her mental state. I asked Keith if he'd be willing to share those texts with Ryan, so he could see exactly how much planning went into this whole thing. Keith didn't even hesitate. He said he wanted Ryan to know the truth because Heather had played both of us and her own brother. He pulled up Ryan's number that Heather had given him weeks ago and forwarded the entire text chain right there at the coffee shop. I watched him scroll through and select message after message. Weeks of manipulation and setup all going to Ryan's phone in real time. Keith also found some texts he'd missed before where Heather had been practicing what she'd say at the party, writing out different versions of her announcement and asking herself which one sounded most believable. There were messages where she discussed timing, saying she needed to wait until enough people had arrived, but before we did our planned thank you speech. The level of calculation in those texts made my stomach turn. Keith hit send on the last batch and sat back looking drained. About 10 minutes later my phone rang and it was Ryan. His voice sounded completely broken when I answered. He said he'd just read through everything Keith sent, and he couldn't believe his sister would plan something so deliberately cruel. He kept saying he was sorry, that he'd been blind and stupid and let this go on for way too long. I could hear him crying and it made me want to cry too, but I was still too angry. I told him we'd talk when I got home and hung up because I couldn't handle that conversation in the middle of a coffee shop. Keith left soon after, thanking us for meeting him and saying he hoped Ryan and I could work things out. Courtney drove me home and made me promise to text her if anything else crazy happened. Wednesday morning I woke up feeling off but couldn't figure out why until I walked into our bedroom to get dressed. Something was different. My closet door was open slightly when I always closed it completely. I walked over and opened it all the way, and my clothes were organized differently than I'd left them. All my shirts were arranged by color now instead of by type, and my shoes were lined up perfectly when I usually just tossed them on the floor. I started pulling things out and realized some of my favorite shirts were missing, including a blue sweater I'd just bought and a black top I wore to work constantly. My heart started racing as I checked the rest of the apartment. Small things were moved in the living room too. The throw pillows on the couch were arranged differently, and some books on the shelf were in the wrong order. Ryan came out of the bathroom and saw my face and immediately asked what was wrong. I told him someone had been in our apartment and he looked confused until I showed him the closet and the missing clothes. His face went pale and he grabbed his phone to call the building manager. While he was on the phone, I checked the kitchen and found more small changes. The coffee mugs were in a different cabinet and someone had reorganized the utensil drawer. Ryan hung up and said the building manager was checking the key log right away. 15 minutes later, the manager called back and confirmed that Heather had used her emergency key to access our apartment 3 times in the past week, always during work hours when she knew we'd be gone. The last time was yesterday afternoon while I was meeting Keith at the coffee shop. Ryan's hands were shaking as he listened to the building manager explain the access records. When he hung up, he looked at me and said he felt sick knowing his sister had been breaking into our home. I told him I felt violated and unsafe, like nowhere was actually private or protected from her. Ryan called the building manager back immediately and demanded they change our locks right away and add Heather to a no-access list. The manager said they could have someone there within an hour and would make sure Heather couldn't enter the building at all anymore. The locksmith showed up 45 minutes later and started changing our locks while Ryan called his mom. I could hear Julian's voice getting defensive through the phone even from across the room. Ryan was trying to explain why we needed to ban Heather from the building, and Julian kept interrupting saying Heather was probably just trying to help by organizing things. She actually said Heather had always been thoughtful like that, wanting to do nice things for people. That's when I lost it. I grabbed the phone from Ryan and told Julian that breaking into someone's home isn't thoughtful, it's criminal. I said her constant excusing of Heather's behavior was a huge part of the problem, and if she couldn't see how wrong this was, then she was just as bad as Heather. Julian got quiet for a second, then started crying and saying I was being cruel, and didn't understand how hard things had been for Heather. I told her I didn't care how hard things had been. That didn't give Heather the right to violate our privacy and steal my clothes. Julian hung up on me, and I handed the phone back to Ryan, feeling my hands shake with anger. Ryan looked exhausted, but he didn't defend his mom this time. Just said we needed to focus on securing our space and dealing with his family later. The locksmith finished and gave us new keys, confirming that Heather's old copies wouldn't work anymore. The building manager also installed a new security camera in our hallway pointing at our door so we'd have a record if Heather tried to come back. By Friday afternoon, Heather's social media posts had gotten worse. She was posting multiple times a day about sibling abandonment and family betrayal, writing these long emotional paragraphs about how her brother had chosen his toxic fiancé over his own blood. People who didn't know the real story were commenting with sympathy and support, saying how sorry they were that she was going through this. Some comments specifically called me toxic and manipulative, saying I was clearly controlling Ryan and isolating him from his family. My brother Drew texted me screenshots of the posts and said he wanted to comment with the truth about what really happened. I told him not to because it would just create more drama and make me look petty and defensive. Drew argued that people needed to know Heather was lying, but I said anyone who mattered already knew the truth, and everyone else's opinion didn't matter. The posts kept coming all weekend though, each one more dramatic than the last. Heather wrote about how she'd always protected her little brother after their dad died, and now he was throwing her away like garbage. She posted old photos of them as kids with captions about how family should be forever. The comments section filled up with people saying Ryan should be ashamed of himself and I should let him have a relationship with his sister. It made me want to scream, but I forced myself to stay off social media and not engage with any of it. Saturday morning, Ryan suggested we take a break from both our families and spend the weekend at a hotel just talking through everything as a couple. I agreed immediately because I needed to get away from the constant crisis management and actually focus on our relationship. We checked into a hotel about 30 minutes away and spent most of Saturday just talking. Ryan finally opened up about things he'd never told me before. He said he'd been terrified of Heather's emotional instability since they were teenagers. After their dad died, Heather had this complete breakdown where she couldn't function at all for months. Their mom made it clear that keeping Heather calm and happy was Ryan's job as her older brother. He'd been doing it for so long that it became automatic, just giving in to whatever she wanted to avoid triggering another crisis. He admitted the whole pattern was toxic, and he knew it. But he'd been too scared to change anything because he didn't want to be responsible for Heather falling apart again. I told him I understood the fear, but it wasn't fair to sacrifice our relationship and my well-being to manage his sister's mental health. Ryan agreed and said he was done putting Heather's feelings above everything else, that it was destroying us and not actually helping her either. Sunday afternoon, while we were still at the hotel, Julian called Ryan crying. She said Heather was in crisis and threatening to hurt herself, that she needed Ryan to come home right away. Ryan's face went white and he started grabbing his stuff to leave. I gently stopped him and pointed out that this was exactly the manipulation pattern he'd just described to me. Heather was using a crisis to pull him back in and make him responsible for her emotional state. Ryan sat back down looking torn, and I suggested we call Julian back together and insist she contact a crisis counselor instead of making Ryan handle it. He nodded and put the phone on speaker. When Julian answered, we told her that Ryan wasn't coming home, but she needed to call a crisis counselor or take Heather to the emergency room if she was genuinely suicidal. Julian got defensive and said Ryan was abandoning his sister when she needed him most. I said Ryan wasn't abandoning anyone. He was setting healthy boundaries, and if Heather was truly in danger, then she needed professional help, not her brother. Julian argued for a few more minutes but eventually agreed to contact a counselor. She hung up sounding angry and hurt, but Ryan looked relieved that we'd held firm. We drove home Sunday night and I went to work Monday morning feeling somewhat better after the weekend away. But during my lunch break, my supervisor pulled me aside and asked if everything was okay. She had this concerned look on her face that immediately made my stomach drop. She said Heather had shown up at the hospital on Friday asking for me. When the front desk wouldn't give out my schedule, Heather had caused a scene in the lobby, crying and demanding to know why I was destroying her family. Security had to escort her out after she refused to leave and started yelling about how I'd stolen her brother. My supervisor said she wanted to make sure I was safe and asked if I needed any support or safety measures at work. I felt completely mortified that my personal drama had spilled into my workplace. I told my supervisor about the engagement party situation and Heather's escalating behavior, and she listened with growing concern. She said the hospital took staff safety seriously, and we should probably file an incident report with HR and security. I agreed even though I felt embarrassed about the whole thing. Monday afternoon, I met with someone from the hospital HR and the security director to file the incident report. I brought photos of Heather from social media so security would recognize her if she came back. The HR representative was understanding and said they'd add Heather to a list of people banned from the premises. The security director asked detailed questions about Heather's behavior patterns and how long this had been going on. When I explained the years of boundary violations and the recent escalation, he looked genuinely worried. He said this level of obsession and willingness to violate boundaries at multiple locations suggested Heather might escalate further. He recommended I consider getting a restraining order if her behavior continued, which felt both extreme and necessary at the same time. I left the meeting feeling drained and scared, realizing this situation was way bigger than family drama and had crossed into something actually dangerous. I drove home from the hospital Monday evening and found Ryan pacing our living room. He'd already heard about Heather showing up at my workplace because Julian had called him crying about it. Ryan looked exhausted and angry in a way I'd never seen before, and he told me he'd scheduled a meeting with his mom for Tuesday morning to have a serious conversation without me there. He wanted to talk to her alone about the family patterns and her role in enabling Heather's behavior. I felt relieved that he was taking this step without me having to push for it. Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang while I was at work and Ryan's name popped up. He asked if I could come home early because he needed to talk about what happened with his mom. I got coverage for the last 2 hours of my shift and drove home feeling anxious about what he'd learned. Ryan was sitting at our kitchen table with red eyes when I walked in. He started talking immediately and told me that Julian had completely broken down during their conversation. She'd admitted that she'd been protecting Heather at everyone else's expense for years because she felt crushing guilt about how Heather fell apart after their dad died. Julian told Ryan that Heather had a complete breakdown when she was 14, about 2 years after their father's death. She stopped eating, stopped going to the school, threatened to hurt herself multiple times. Julian had been terrified and felt like she'd already lost her husband and couldn't lose her daughter too. So she started walking on eggshells around Heather, giving in to every demand, never setting boundaries because she was afraid any pushback would trigger another crisis. Ryan said his mom cried for an hour while telling him all of this. Then Julian shared things Ryan never knew about Heather's adult life. Heather had failed out of college twice, once from a nursing program and once from a business degree. She'd lost multiple jobs due to conflicts with coworkers and supervisors, always blaming others for the problems. She'd never maintained a romantic relationship longer than a few months because she'd get too intense too fast and scare people away. Every single time Heather's life fell apart, she became more obsessed with Ryan as her only stable connection. Julian admitted she'd enabled all of it because dealing with Heather's rage and despair when anyone tried to create distance was too hard. It was easier to just give Heather what she wanted and make Ryan responsible for keeping her calm. Ryan told me he felt sick hearing all of this laid out so clearly. He'd known Heather struggled but didn't realize the extent of her failures, or how deliberately Julian had made him responsible for his sister's emotional state. But he also felt relieved to finally understand the full picture of what we were dealing with. Julian had agreed during their conversation that Heather needed professional help and real consequences, not more protection from reality. She promised to stop making Ryan responsible for managing Heather's emotions, though Ryan said he was skeptical she'd actually follow through when things got hard. I hugged Ryan while he processed everything and told him I was proud of him for having that conversation. We spent the rest of Tuesday evening talking through what this meant for us and how we'd handle things going forward. 2 weeks after the party, Ryan brought up the idea of couples therapy. He said he knew I was still hurt by years of him dismissing my concerns and choosing Heather's comfort over my well-being. He wanted us to work through those trust issues with professional help before we moved forward with wedding planning. I agreed right away because I desperately needed him to understand how deeply his enabling had damaged us. Our first session was difficult. I sat across from Ryan in the therapist's office and explained how gaslit I'd felt every time he defended Heather's boundary violations. I told him about all the times I'd questioned my own perception because he insisted I was overreacting or being too sensitive. Ryan listened, and I could see him struggling with guilt as he realized how much harm his denial had caused. He admitted to the therapist that he'd been so afraid of Heather falling apart that he'd sacrificed our relationship to keep peace. The therapist helped us start unpacking these patterns, but it was clear we had a lot of work ahead. During this time, Heather started texting Ryan constantly. The messages alternated between apologetic and angry. One text would say she was sorry and in therapy now, working on herself. The next would accuse Ryan of abandoning her when she needed him most. She claimed she was making progress, but her texts showed no real insight or accountability. Ryan showed me every single message as they came in, which I appreciated. We brought them to our therapy sessions, and our therapist helped Ryan see the manipulation tactics Heather was using. She pointed out how Heather would apologize just enough to get a response, then immediately shift to accusations when Ryan didn't give her what she wanted. The therapist coached Ryan on setting firm boundaries in his responses and not engaging with the manipulation. I met Keith for coffee again about 3 weeks after the party. He looked better than the last time I'd seen him, less shocked and more angry. He told me that Heather had been trying to contact him too, wanting to explain her side of what happened. She'd sent him dozens of messages asking for another chance and saying they had something special. Keith showed me his phone, and I counted over 50 texts from Heather in one day. Some were sexually explicit, trying to remind him of their physical relationship. Others were mean and accusatory, calling him a coward for walking away and saying he'd never find anyone who loved him like she did. Keith had finally blocked her number after the 50th text. He said he was considering getting a restraining order because her behavior was scaring him. Hearing this from Keith validated everything I'd been feeling. This wasn't just difficult sibling dynamics or me misinterpreting Heather's intentions. Her behavior was genuinely disturbing and dangerous. 3 weeks after the party, my mom hosted a family dinner at her house for just my side of the family. She said she wanted to give me space to process everything without Ryan's family drama hanging over us. Drew was there with his girlfriend, and my aunt and uncle came too. It felt good to be around people who just supported me without any complicated history. Drew pulled me aside before dinner and told me he was proud of how I'd handled the confrontation at the party. He admitted he'd never liked how Heather treated me, but hadn't wanted to interfere in Ryan's family dynamics. My mom asked me privately if I was sure about marrying into this family, which hurt even though I knew it was a fair question. I told my mom that I loved Ryan and believed he was finally seeing the problem clearly, but I also said I wasn't setting a wedding date until we'd made real progress in therapy and established boundaries with Heather that actually held. I needed to see sustained change, not just promises. My mom supported this decision completely, and then surprised me by offering to help pay for the therapy sessions. She pointed out that our engagement party money was gone and therapy wasn't cheap. I felt grateful for her practical support and the validation that my feelings and boundaries were reasonable. A week later, Ryan's therapist recommended we see someone who specialized in family systems. That's how we found Ainsley Hudson. She agreed to see us as a couple and said she might facilitate family sessions later if appropriate. Our first meeting with Ainsley was eye-opening. She immediately identified the enmeshment between Ryan and Heather after hearing our story. Ainsley explained how Julian's grief and guilt after her husband's death had created an unhealthy dynamic where Heather never developed her own identity separate from her brother. She said this wasn't about Ryan being a good brother, or Heather being intentionally malicious at first. The family system itself was broken, and everyone had fallen into dysfunctional roles. This framework helped Ryan understand that truly loving his sister meant letting her face consequences and develop independence, not rescuing her from every difficulty. 4 weeks after the party, Heather showed up at Ryan's workplace. His boss called him into the office and said a woman was in the lobby demanding to see him and refusing to leave. Ryan went down and found Heather crying and insisting they needed to talk immediately. When Ryan said he was at work and couldn't do this now, Heather got louder and started making a scene. Ryan's boss had to come down and ask Heather to leave. She finally left, but Ryan was completely embarrassed that his professional reputation had been damaged by family drama. He texted Heather that afternoon and set a clear boundary. No more unannounced visits to his home or workplace. No more manipulation or guilt trips. He would only communicate with her through one scheduled phone call per week, and only if she was actually working with a therapist, and could provide proof. He told Heather she needed to leave right now. His voice shook but stayed firm, something I'd never heard from him before. Heather's screaming got louder and she accused him of picking me over his own blood, said their dad would be ashamed of how he treated family. The guests who hadn't left yet stood frozen, some still holding their phones up despite my mom quietly asking them to stop filming. Ryan's mom, Julian, rushed over trying to calm Heather down, but Heather shoved her away hard enough that Julian stumbled backward. My brother Drew stepped forward and told Heather firmly that she needed to leave before he called security. That finally broke through her hysteria enough that she stumbled toward the exit, still crying so hard she could barely breathe, mascara streaming down that white dress. Julian followed her out while shooting Ryan a devastated look that made him flinch. The DJ started playing music again to fill the awful silence, but half the remaining guests were already grabbing coats and making excuses to leave. We were home by 10, and I felt completely numb about the wasted money and ruined night. That night, my phone started going crazy with texts from Heather. She called Ryan cruel and heartless, said I'd completely changed him and destroyed their sibling bond. The messages kept coming, dozens of them, getting more frantic as the night went on. Around 2 in the morning, she texted that she couldn't do this anymore, that she was going to hurt herself and it would be Ryan's fault for abandoning her when she needed him most. Ryan saw the messages and went into complete panic mode, grabbing his keys and heading for the door. I stopped him and called Ainsley even though it was the middle of the night. She answered on the 3rd ring, voice groggy but alert when I explained what was happening. Ainsley told Ryan clearly that he wasn't responsible for preventing his sister's self-harm, that responding to suicide threats only taught Heather that this manipulation worked. She walked us through calling Julian instead to do a wellness check, which we did right there at 2:30 in the morning. Julian sounded exhausted when she answered and admitted that Heather had been using suicide threats to control family members for years. She'd never actually attempted anything, just knew that threatening it would make everyone drop everything and focus on her needs. Ryan looked sick hearing his mom confirm what Ainsley had just explained. The next morning, I told Ryan I needed him to get back those apartment keys Heather had made before I could feel safe in our own home again. The thought of her having access while we slept or worked made my skin crawl. Ryan called the building manager right away to check their records. The manager pulled up the key logs and found that Heather had made 3 copies of our emergency key over the past 6 months, but she'd only returned one when Ryan took it from her purse at the party. The building manager was upset about the unauthorized duplication and said he'd pursue legal action if necessary, documenting everything as a lease violation and potential criminal trespass issue. He agreed to change our locks immediately and add Heather to a permanent no-access list for the building. Ryan looked relieved but also horrified that his sister had been that calculated about maintaining access to our space. Later that week, Ryan drove to his mom's house where Heather was staying and demanded all the apartment keys. I stayed home because I couldn't handle seeing Heather again so soon. Ryan texted me updates as things happened. Heather refused to hand over the keys and Julian wavered, telling Ryan he was being too harsh and that Heather needed family support right now, not more punishment. Ryan held firm for the first time in his life. He told his mom that enabling Heather's boundary violations wasn't love, it was harm, and if they wouldn't support healthy limits, then he'd have limited contact with both of them. I could barely believe he'd actually said that to Julian. His next text said Julian's face had gone pale, but she'd finally backed him up, physically taking the keys from Heather's purse herself and handing them over. Heather screamed that there was nothing wrong with wanting to help her brother and his ungrateful fiancé, that we were treating her like a criminal for caring about family. Ryan left feeling shaky but proud according to his texts. When he got home and showed me the 2 additional keys, I felt relieved but also couldn't fully trust that those were all the copies. We decided right then to install a security camera in our apartment hallway, just in case Heather had made more copies we didn't know about. 5 weeks after the party, Courtney invited me on a girls' weekend trip to help me decompress from all the constant family drama. She'd noticed I looked exhausted at work and thought getting away might help. Ryan encouraged me to go, saying he'd use the time to have more difficult conversations with his mom about their family patterns. I hesitated because leaving him alone with all this felt wrong, but I also recognized I needed a break from the intensity. The last few weeks had been nothing but crisis management and boundary setting, and I was running on empty. I packed a bag and met Courtney and 2 other nurse friends at her car Friday morning. The drive to the beach rental took 3 hours, and I felt tension leaving my shoulders the farther we got from home. While I was away that weekend, Ryan and Julian had their most honest conversation ever about how their dad's death had shaped the whole family. Ryan called me Saturday night to tell me about it, his voice thick with emotion. Julian had finally admitted she'd made Ryan into a surrogate parent for Heather, instead of getting proper grief counseling for all of them after his dad died. She revealed that Heather's therapist from years ago had recommended family therapy and clear boundaries, but Julian had refused because she couldn't handle both kids being upset with her at the same time. It was easier to let Ryan manage Heather's emotions than to deal with the fallout of setting limits. Ryan told his mom that decision had damaged everyone, that Heather never learned to cope with disappointment or develop her own identity, that he'd spent his whole adult life managing his sister's feelings instead of building his own life. But he also said it wasn't too late to do better, that they could start making healthier choices now, even though it would be hard. Sunday afternoon, Julian called Ryan back and said she'd thought about everything he said all night. She agreed to start her own therapy to address her enabling patterns and the grief she'd never properly processed after losing her husband. She admitted she'd been afraid of Heather's anger and intensity since the teenage breakdown, essentially letting a traumatized child run the family dynamics into adulthood, because it felt safer than confronting the real problems. Julian cried on the phone and apologized for making Ryan responsible for his sister's mental health, for dismissing my concerns for years, for choosing the path of least resistance instead of doing what was actually best for everyone. Ryan came away from that conversation with more compassion for his mom, but also clarity that she'd contributed significantly to the dysfunction, even if she hadn't meant to cause harm. I got back from my weekend away Sunday night feeling refreshed and grateful for supportive friends who'd validated my experiences without any complicated family history involved. Ryan was waiting when I walked in and immediately told me about his conversations with Julian. He looked hopeful in a way I hadn't seen in weeks, talking about how his mom finally seemed ready to change her patterns and acknowledge her role in everything. We sat on the couch and talked for hours about what this might mean for our future. We were both cautiously optimistic, but agreed to maintain our boundaries regardless of whether Julian actually followed through on her promises. Too many times before people had said they'd change, and then fallen back into old patterns when things got difficult. 6 weeks after the party, a woman named Sarah, who was friends with Heather, reached out to Ryan saying she was worried. Heather had been increasingly erratic and isolated, barely responding to texts or leaving Julian's house. Sarah revealed that Heather had been fired from her medical office job 3 weeks earlier for interpersonal conflicts with coworkers, and hadn't told anyone in the family. She'd been lying about going to work every day when really she was just staying in her room at Julian's house. Sarah said she was concerned Heather might be having a genuine mental health crisis beyond just manipulation tactics, which made everything more complicated. Ryan looked torn when he showed me the messages, caught between maintaining boundaries and worrying about his sister's actual well-being. That night, Ryan and I sat down to discuss whether we had any responsibility to help Heather get proper mental health treatment. We called Ainsley and had a phone session right then, because we needed guidance. Ainsley helped us understand that we could care about Heather's well-being while maintaining our boundaries, that these two things weren't mutually exclusive. She explained that the most loving thing might actually be letting Heather hit rock bottom instead of rescuing her from the consequences of her behavior. If we kept stepping in to fix things, Heather would never have motivation to do the hard work of actual change. We decided together that we'd encourage Julian to pursue intensive treatment options for Heather, maybe even a residential program if that's what the professionals recommended. But we wouldn't personally intervene or soften our boundaries just because Heather was struggling. Her mental health crisis didn't erase the years of violation and manipulation we'd experienced. Ryan and I spent the next few days processing everything Ainsley had said about letting Heather face consequences instead of rushing in to fix things. It felt wrong somehow, knowing she was struggling and choosing not to help, but I also knew we'd been down that road before, and it never led anywhere good. Then Thursday night around 9, Ryan's phone rang and it was Julian calling, which was unusual because she usually texted first. Ryan put her on speaker, and I could hear immediately that she'd been crying hard, her voice all shaky and rough. She told us that Heather had finally agreed to see a real therapist, not just the counselor she'd seen years ago, and they'd had an evaluation session that afternoon. The therapist diagnosed Heather with borderline personality disorder and severe attachment issues that went all the way back to when their dad died. Julian kept apologizing while she talked, saying she should have gotten Heather proper help years ago instead of just hoping things would get better on their own. The therapist recommended intensive outpatient treatment, maybe even a residential program if Heather's symptoms got worse, because the patterns were so deep and long-standing. Then Julian asked the question I'd been dreading, whether Ryan and I would be willing to participate in family therapy sessions as part of Heather's treatment plan. Ryan looked at me with this hopeful but scared expression, clearly wanting to say yes, but also not wanting to pressure me after everything. I told Julian we needed time to think about it and discuss with our own therapist before making any promises. She understood, but I could hear the disappointment in her voice when she said okay, and hung up. Ryan and I stayed up late talking about what participating in family therapy would mean and whether we could handle being in a room with Heather again. Part of me wanted to just cut ties completely and move on with our lives, but another part knew that Heather was Ryan's sister, and if there was any chance of her actually getting better, maybe we owed it to everyone to try. Friday afternoon, we had an emergency session with Ainsley to talk through Julian's request and figure out what the right decision was. Ainsley listened to everything and then asked us what we were afraid would happen if we participated in family therapy. I told her I was scared that Heather would use the sessions to manipulate everyone again, that she'd cry and apologize but not actually change anything, and we'd end up right back where we started. Ryan admitted he was worried about seeing his sister in such bad shape and feeling guilty enough to drop all our boundaries. Ainsley nodded and said those were valid concerns, but that family therapy could also be a chance to establish clear expectations with professional support. She suggested we agree to participate, but with very specific conditions that protected us. Heather would have to be actively engaged in her own treatment first, not just showing up to family sessions. The sessions would focus on establishing healthy boundaries, not on us forgiving and forgetting everything that happened. And we could leave any session that became abusive or unproductive without guilt or pressure to stay. Ainsley also recommended we limit how many family sessions we committed to initially, maybe just 3 or 4 to see how things went. Ryan liked this approach because it gave his sister a chance without requiring us to sacrifice our own well-being. I was still nervous about being in a room with Heather after everything, but I agreed that if we had clear conditions and Ainsley's support, I was willing to try. We called Julian that night and told her we'd participate in limited family therapy sessions, as long as Heather was serious about her own treatment, and everyone respected our boundaries. Julian thanked us over and over, saying she knew it was a lot to ask and she appreciated us being willing to work toward healing as a family. 7 weeks after the engagement party disaster, we drove to the therapy office for our first family session. My stomach felt sick the whole drive there, and I kept thinking of reasons we should turn around and go home. Ryan held my hand tight in the parking lot and reminded me we could leave whenever we needed to, that this was just to see if Heather was actually changing or if it was more of the same manipulation. We walked into the office and Heather was already there with Julian, sitting in the waiting room. I barely recognized her at first because she'd lost so much weight and looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes and her hair pulled back in a messy way that wasn't like her usual perfect appearance. She wouldn't make eye contact with either of us, just stared at her hands folded in her lap. The therapist, a woman named Dr. Miller, came out and brought us all into her office, arranging chairs in a circle so everyone could see each other. She explained how the session would work and emphasized that this was a safe space for honest communication with the goal of understanding and healing. Then she asked Heather if she was ready to share what she'd prepared, and Heather pulled out a folded piece of paper from her pocket with shaking hands. She read from it in this quiet voice, acknowledging specific things she'd done that were harmful and wrong. She mentioned stealing my nursing school milestone, moving into the apartment above us, using her emergency key to invade our privacy, and staging the fake engagement at our party. For each thing, she said she understood now why it was hurtful and controlling, and she took responsibility without making excuses. Her apology felt somewhat real, like she actually meant the words she was saying, but it also felt rehearsed and careful, like she'd practiced it 100 times with Dr. Miller. I sat there listening and feeling this weird mix of relief that she was finally acknowledging what she'd done, and suspicion that this might just be another manipulation tactic to get back into our lives. Dr. Miller asked Heather to talk about what she'd learned in her therapy sessions about why she engaged in those behaviors. Heather put down the paper and actually looked at Ryan for the first time, tears running down her face. She said that after their dad died, she became obsessed with Ryan because he was the only stable thing in her life, and she was terrified of losing him too. She admitted that she never developed her own identity or figured out what she actually wanted, instead just copying whatever I did because it seemed like that's what made people successful and happy. She said that inserting herself into our relationship and stealing my milestones wasn't really about wanting those things for herself. It was about feeling important and needed and connected to Ryan's life. Dr. Miller added that Heather's sense of self was so fragile that she literally didn't know who she was as a separate person without attaching to Ryan's life and relationships. She explained that this pattern was common in people with borderline personality disorder who experienced abandonment trauma young, but that understanding the cause didn't excuse the harmful behavior. Heather nodded and said she could see now how her actions were controlling and invasive, how she'd violated my privacy and safety repeatedly, and how she'd put Ryan in an impossible position for years. Julian spoke up then and apologized too, saying she'd enabled all of this by making Ryan responsible for Heather's emotions, instead of getting proper help for her daughter. She admitted she'd been so afraid of Heather falling apart completely that she just let the unhealthy patterns continue and get worse. Ryan asked Heather directly why she staged the fake engagement at our party, what she thought would happen. Heather cried harder and said she'd panicked when she realized Ryan was actually getting married and moving forward with his life without her. She thought if she could create drama and chaos, maybe he'd postpone the wedding or at least pay attention to her again instead of focusing on me. She admitted it was manipulative and cruel, and that she'd hurt Keith too by using him as a prop in her scheme. Dr. Miller turned to me and asked if I wanted to share how Heather's behavior had affected me over the years. I took a deep breath and told them everything I'd been holding in. How violated I felt coming home to find Heather in my apartment touching my things. How dismissed and crazy I felt when Ryan defended her behavior instead of believing my concerns. How humiliated I was at the engagement party in front of all our friends and family. Ryan sat beside me holding my hand while I talked, and I could see him really hearing the full impact of his enabling for the first time. Heather listened without interrupting or getting defensive, which was new and unexpected. When I finished, she said quietly that she could see how her behavior was controlling and invasive and scary, that if someone had done those things to her, she would have felt unsafe and violated too. Dr. Miller emphasized that understanding and apologizing were important first steps, but real change would require years of consistent work and therapy, not just this one conversation. She said that Heather needed to develop her own identity and coping skills, that she needed to learn how to tolerate uncomfortable emotions without trying to control other people, and that recovery from borderline personality disorder was possible but difficult and ongoing. We left the session 2 hours later feeling completely drained, but also like maybe there was a tiny path forward. Ryan and I sat in the car for a while before driving home, just processing everything we'd heard. He asked if I thought Heather was being genuine, or if this was just a more sophisticated manipulation, and I told him honestly that I didn't know yet. The apology felt more real than anything she'd said before, and she'd actually listened to my feelings without making it about her. But I also knew that people with her diagnosis could be very good at saying what others wanted to hear. We agreed that we'd continue with the limited family therapy sessions we'd committed to, but our relationship with Heather would stay boundaried for a long time, maybe forever. I told Ryan I wasn't looking for some close sisterly bond or family reconciliation. I just wanted peaceful coexistence where Heather respected our space and autonomy. He said that was fair and reasonable, that he wanted the same thing, and that he was proud of me for being willing to try this at all after everything she'd put me through. 2 months after the engagement party, Julian called to tell us that Heather had started an intensive outpatient program at a mental health facility across town. She went to group therapy every day and had individual sessions 3 times a week, plus medication management with a psychiatrist. Julian said that Heather seemed to be actually engaging with the treatment this time, not just going through the motions like she had with counseling years ago. She'd hit some kind of bottom where her manipulative patterns stopped working, and people stopped responding the way she wanted, which made her desperate enough to do real work on herself. I was glad Heather was getting help, but I also kept my emotional distance, knowing that recovery wasn't a straight line, and she could easily fall back into old patterns when things got hard. Ryan and I agreed to keep attending the monthly family therapy sessions, as long as Heather stayed committed to her treatment and respected our boundaries. Ryan and I made our own progress in couples therapy with Ainsley, working through all the resentment I'd built up from years of feeling like I came second to his sister. We did exercises where Ryan practiced recognizing manipulation tactics and responding with clear boundaries instead of guilt-driven accommodation. He got better at seeing when someone was trying to make him responsible for their emotions, and he learned to say no without feeling like a terrible person. I worked on trusting that he'd actually changed and wouldn't just revert to enabling the moment Heather applied pressure again. Ainsley helped me understand that my caution was valid and protective, but that I also needed to give Ryan credit for the real changes he was making instead of waiting for him to fail. We had hard conversations about what our marriage would look like and what role his family would play in our lives. Ryan promised that he'd never again dismiss my feelings or concerns to protect someone else's comfort, that our relationship would always come first, even when family situations got complicated. One afternoon, about 9 weeks after the party, I got a text from Keith asking if we could talk sometime. I was surprised because we hadn't heard from him since that coffee meeting where he'd shown us Heather's manipulative texts. I texted back saying sure, and we set up a phone call for that evening. Keith thanked me for exposing Heather's manipulation at the party, and said that walking away from that situation probably saved him from what would have been a really toxic relationship. He told me he was dating someone new now, a woman he'd met through friends who he described as genuine and stable and honest. He sounded happy talking about her, relieved to be with someone who didn't play games or use him as a prop in family drama. Then he mentioned that Heather had tried to contact him again a few weeks ago, sending long apologetic texts and asking if they could talk. He'd maintained his block and didn't respond, having learned his lesson about getting involved with people who manipulate others for their own purposes. I told him I was glad he'd moved on and found someone good, and that he deserved a healthy relationship after what Heather put him through. We talked for a bit longer about how he was doing, and then said goodbye with him wishing Ryan and me luck with everything. 10 weeks after the engagement party disaster, Ryan and I had a serious conversation about our wedding timeline while making dinner together one Saturday night. I told him that I needed at least 6 more months of sustained boundary maintenance and therapy progress before I'd feel comfortable actually setting a date. I explained that I wanted to see Heather stay committed to her treatment through difficult times, not just when things were easy, and I needed to trust that Ryan would hold firm on boundaries even when family pressure got intense. Ryan agreed without any defensiveness or trying to convince me otherwise, which was huge growth from how he would have responded before. He said he wanted to earn back my full trust and prove that he could prioritize our relationship even when his mom or sister needed something. He told me that our marriage was more important than rushing into a wedding before we were both truly ready, and that he'd wait as long as I needed to feel secure and confident about our future together. 2 weeks later, we sat in Ainsley's office for another family therapy session with Heather and Julian. Heather looked better than last time, less pale and shaky, more present in her own body. She talked about what she'd been learning in her intensive program, explaining how her therapist helped her see that when their dad died, she basically transferred all her security needs onto Ryan. She said she never developed her own sense of who she was because she was too busy trying to stay connected to him, and that fear of losing that connection made her do increasingly extreme things to force closeness. Ainsley asked her what she understood now about how that affected Ryan and me, and Heather said she could see that her attempts to stay close actually pushed Ryan away and made him resent her. She admitted that trying to control his life and relationships was the opposite of real connection, that she'd been treating him like a security blanket instead of a separate person with his own life. The therapist walked her through examples of respecting autonomy versus forcing proximity, and Heather seemed to actually understand the difference for the first time. Julian spoke up more in this session than she had in previous ones, her voice shaky but determined. She told Ryan she was sorry for making him responsible for Heather's feelings all these years, that she'd put an unfair burden on him when he was just a kid himself dealing with grief. She turned to me and apologized for dismissing my concerns for so long, admitting she'd seen the boundary violations but chose to excuse them because addressing them felt too hard. Her apology didn't feel rehearsed or defensive like I expected, just sad and genuine, acknowledging that her fear of dealing with Heather's reactions had hurt everyone. She said she'd been working with her own therapist on why she enabled the dysfunction, instead of getting Heather real help years ago, and she was committed to supporting healthy boundaries now even when it felt uncomfortable. I wanted to stay skeptical, but her consistency over the past weeks made me think she might actually mean it this time. 3 months after the engagement party disaster, Ryan and I drove to the beach where he'd originally proposed. We rented a small cottage right on the water and spent the weekend just being together without crisis management or family drama constantly pulling our attention. We walked along the shore talking about our relationship, remembering the early days when we'd fallen in love and everything felt easy and full of possibility. Ryan told me about the future he imagined for us, one where we made decisions together without his family's dysfunction controlling our choices. He promised that our marriage would have clear boundaries with his family, that he'd never again dismiss my feelings to protect someone else's comfort, that I would always come first even when situations got complicated. I believed him in a way I couldn't have even a month earlier, seeing the real changes in how he handled pressure and prioritized us. We talked about what our wedding might look like now that the big celebration we'd planned felt tainted by what happened. I told Ryan I was starting to feel hopeful about our future again, that watching him maintain boundaries even when Julian or Heather pushed back made me trust he'd really changed. We agreed the wedding should be smaller and more intimate than originally planned, maybe 50 people who actually cared about us instead of the 100-plus guest list we'd been building. Ryan said he was okay with that shift, that he'd rather have something authentic and meaningful than recreate the party Heather had destroyed. We spent hours discussing details, imagining a ceremony that reflected who we actually were, instead of trying to impress his family or meet anyone's expectations. Heather finished her intensive outpatient program around the same time and moved to weekly individual therapy plus monthly family sessions. Julian reported that Heather's therapist said she was making genuine progress in developing her own identity separate from Ryan. She'd started taking art classes at the community center and volunteering at an animal shelter, beginning to build a life that wasn't centered on her brother's activities and relationships. Julian sent me photos Heather had painted in her class, abstract pieces that were actually pretty good, and mentioned that Heather talked about the shelter dogs constantly now instead of obsessing over what Ryan was doing. It felt like real change, not just temporary good behavior to manipulate us back into her life. 4 months after the party, we had another family therapy session where Heather made a different kind of apology than her first attempt. She took full responsibility for the engagement party disaster and years of boundary violations without the rehearsed quality that had made her previous apology feel hollow. She said her behavior was abusive and manipulative regardless of her mental health struggles, that having trauma didn't excuse treating people the way she'd treated us. She didn't ask for forgiveness or demand that we let her back into our lives, just expressed genuine regret and commitment to continued treatment. Ainsley asked what she would do differently now, and Heather said she'd respect our boundaries even if it felt painful, that she was learning to sit with uncomfortable feelings instead of acting on them to force closeness. I felt something shift in my chest listening to her. Not full trust, but maybe the beginning of believing she understood what she'd done wrong. I told Heather I appreciated her work in therapy, but trust would take years to rebuild, that I needed her to respect that I might never want a close relationship with her. She nodded and said she understood, that she had no right to demand closeness after violating my trust and safety so many times. Her acceptance of that boundary without argument or guilt-tripping felt like the most genuine interaction we'd ever had. Ryan and I decided we were ready to set a wedding date for 8 months out, giving us time to plan something meaningful while continuing therapy and boundary work. We told our families together at Julian's house, making it clear that the wedding would have specific rules. No surprise announcements, no drama, and if anyone couldn't respect our boundaries, they wouldn't be invited regardless of family connection. Julian and Heather both agreed to the terms without pushing back or trying to negotiate exceptions. Heather even said she understood if we preferred she didn't attend, that she'd respect whatever decision we made about her presence. Ryan told her she could come if she maintained appropriate behavior and continued her treatment, but one boundary violation would mean immediate removal from the venue. Over the next few months, Heather kept appropriate distance and respected our boundaries without us having to constantly enforce them. She didn't try to insert herself into wedding planning or contact us outside scheduled family therapy sessions. Julian called me once a week with updates, mentioning that Heather was doing well in her continued treatment and had started dating someone new from her art class. She said Heather was taking it slow and being honest with him about her mental health journey, which seemed like real progress from her pattern of love bombing and moving too fast. Julian also reported that Heather's volunteer work at the shelter had expanded to 3 days a week, that she was talking about maybe going back to the school for veterinary technology instead of nursing like she'd claimed to want when copying my career path. 5 months after the engagement party we attended, what Ainsley said would be our last scheduled family therapy session. The therapist told us she was impressed with everyone's progress, that the family system had fundamentally changed from what she called enmeshed and enabling to boundaried and healthier. She said Ryan and Heather's relationship could potentially be rebuilt over time into something more balanced, but that would require Heather continuing her individual work and everyone respecting the limits that had been established. Ainsley recommended Ryan and I continue our couples therapy, and that Julian keep seeing her individual therapist, but we could step back from family sessions unless new issues came up. Walking out of that office felt like closing a chapter, not the end of the story, but a significant shift in how we'd all relate to each other going forward. I felt something settle in my chest over the next few weeks, watching Ryan maintain boundaries without me having to remind him. He told his mom no when she asked if Heather could help pick our wedding venue, explaining calmly that we needed to do this ourselves. Julian accepted it without pushing back. Heather sent a single text congratulating us on setting a date. Nothing more, and didn't try to insert herself into any decisions. Ryan showed me every interaction, keeping everything transparent like we'd agreed in therapy. It wasn't perfect, but it felt real and sustainable, like we'd actually built something solid instead of just hoping things would magically improve. My anxiety about planning started fading when I realized I could actually enjoy this instead of waiting for the next crisis. We picked a small garden venue that held 50 people max, booking it for early September when the weather would be perfect. My mom cried happy tears when we told her, saying she was so relieved to see me excited instead of stressed. Drew offered to walk me down the aisle and joked that he'd personally remove anyone who tried to cause drama, which made me laugh for the first time in months about this whole situation. Ryan's family kept appropriate distance during planning, with Julian calling once to offer help, but accepting our polite refusal without guilt-tripping. Heather sent one more text saying she was happy for us and looking forward to the celebration, keeping it simple and not making it about herself at all. We sent out invitations to people who actually cared about us, skipping the big guest list we'd originally planned, and every response felt genuine instead of obligatory. 6 months after that terrible engagement party, I stood in a small room at the garden venue adjusting my dress. My mom and Courtney helped with final touches while Drew waited outside to walk me down the aisle. The ceremony was everything the party wasn't. Quiet and intimate with 50 guests who smiled because they were genuinely happy for us. Ryan's eyes got watery when I walked toward him, and the officiant kept things short and meaningful. Heather sat in the third row next to Julian, wearing a pale blue dress, hands folded in her lap. She smiled politely during the ceremony, clapped at appropriate moments, stayed in her seat during photos. At dinner, she ate quietly, congratulated us once with a simple hug, and left right after dessert, without lingering or trying to insert herself into conversations. Drew leaned over during dancing and said this was the wedding we should have had from the start, and he was absolutely right. No drama, no surprise announcements, just people celebrating our actual relationship. On our honeymoon in a beach house rental, Ryan and I finally had space to talk without crisis management mode activated. We sat on the deck watching the ocean, and he brought up how the engagement party disaster forced changes that probably saved our relationship. I agreed, saying I'd been close to walking away before he finally saw what I'd been trying to tell him for years. He admitted he'd been terrified of Heather falling apart, but realized enabling her actually made everything worse for everyone, including her. We talked about the clear boundaries we'd established with his family, and how he'd learned to prioritize our partnership over his guilt about his sister's feelings. I told him I felt hopeful about our future now that Heather was getting real help and respecting our space. Our marriage was starting on honest ground with actual communication and mutual respect, instead of me always coming second to family drama. It felt like we'd earned this happiness through hard work and difficult conversations, instead of just hoping everything would magically work out.